Well, hey folks, it's your old pal, King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. I'm going to talk a little bit about Orc+Bone and I guess just some general advice and discussion topics for game masters out there who have bought a copy of this and are looking to use it or incorporate elements of it into a different kind of D&D game. Orc+Bone is an OSR setting. It was the first role-playing game I wrote. It's key to go off the white box rules, largely because I felt that they were kind of a little underserved in terms of like having people having written supplements to go with them. And also, you know, they're cheap and they go hand in hand with the philosophy of less is more, of the various, restoration project OSRs, you could say, where they're trying to recreate the exact feel of some of the older box sets and such. This is my personal favorite. I like that it caps off at level 10 and all that other kind of stuff, and so it's the one I decided to go with. However, Orc+Bone radically changes the kind of game it is. Introduces several different classic races as playable. I give my own version of half-elves and halflings, and also provide my own version of orcs and gnolls. My version of orcs are obviously very central to the whole premise of the thing. I kind of go a bit more back to Tolkien, and that the lore of their backstory is that, in whatever ancient war you had between the elves and the dwarves back in the end of the First Age kind of shit, the dwarves had, found and domesticated and educated cavemen into being like the first civilized humans, and they were kind of using them as like soldiers in their, efforts to take down, whatever kind of weird elf empire was going on at the time. And so the elves, a group of them who were like exceptional warriors and were super loyal to the cause and the salvation of the elven race and all that, volunteered themselves to be transformed into the first generation of orcs, where they lost some of their immortality, but they were given a more robust frame and warrior capacities, and the night vision and the ability to have enhanced sense of smell and hearing and all that kind of stuff, to make them more effective hunters and killers and all that kind of shit. And also, in some ways, the orcs are like the elves' critique of what they thought of humanity too, in kind of a way, because they were supposed to be trying to make them to match human ferocity and all that kind of stuff. Except, the war came to an end, and whatever kind of truce or stalemate, between the various peoples happened, and then various ages of time have gone on since then, and orcs were kind of abandoned. When they were no longer directly useful for them, they were a bit of an embarrassment. Orcs jar greatly against the elven aesthetic and want for beauty and beautiful things, and orcs are very much not that. So orcs are kind of relegated to a kind of lonely exile existence on the hinterlands of whatever the known central world is. And aside from being used occasionally by small petty tyrants on the fringes of civilization, or petty warlords and weird magicians with strange plots to want to take over the world and all that kind of stuff, they developed a reputation of being a barbaric race of just ravenous killers and all that kind of stuff. And whereas yes, it's very much in their nature. They're more sophisticated in their own way secretly than people give them credit for. It's not like these random tyrants and random wizards were just ordering up tons and tons of armor and weapon for an orc horde out of nowhere. The orcs have their own mining and have their own manufacturing, going kind of again with that Tolkien flavor. Low-key in the Tolkien universe, the orcs are actually among the more sophisticated technological races in terms of understanding industry and all that, having a process to mass-produce war goods and explosives and all that other kind of stuff. So kind of trying to bring more of that flavor back into it. The orcs were much more self-sufficient in terms of equipping themselves to be, a fearsome warrior race. They just kind of had no real direction. The people that they would be most inclined to actually listening to wanted nothing to do with them, and over the thousands of years that burned a lot of bitter kind of spiteful hatred towards, you know, their own creators. You know, like orcs, like, you know, might not like go out of their way to like try to like wipe elves out or any of that kind of stuff, and they might generally like leave their settlements alone, but they despise them because they were rejected, kind of a thing. And also, you know, like they're just like humans, just kind of just of being dishonorable opponents on the battlefield, and being petty and dumb, and not, you know, like the orcs on some level still like feel highly of themselves as being of the line of elves, even if they're not included anymore in any of that. And you know, so like they still view humans as being lesser beings, and just animals that the dwarves tamed to be used as lapdogs and all that kind of stuff. And so they just kind of existed out there on the edge of the world, and you know, within like the civilized lands, you know, events go along. The elves kind of drift off out, you know, beyond the borders of what is known. The dwarves at some point seal themselves up in their underground kingdoms and are never heard from again. And human civilization at that point kind of takes over. In many ways, also by having like absorbed and taken some of the technology left over on the surface from the dwarves. You know, you're finally your big age of human empires. Starts off as a bunch of big kingdoms, but all eventually merges into one kind of big thing. You know, you sweep in a bunch of, you know, like other smaller races in terms of numbers, like all eventually just kind of like have to accept life within this human empire. It even does some oddly noble things at first, like it makes a point of like, we're gonna like take care of the dragon and giant menace, and we're gonna like free the goblins from, you know, thousands of years of servitude to hobgoblins and all that kind of stuff. Bringing goblins in as kind of like a servant class along some certain coastal areas. And, you know, also working on like underground projects and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, though, at some point something goes wrong. Demon and devil worship starts to spread through the nobility of this human empire, and things get increasingly corrupt and evil across all the land. Most of the old cults and religions are kind of forgotten in place of devil worship. And there's just the very beginnings of a revolutionary sentiment from the common populace and from the few people who still practiced old pagan beliefs that, you know, we got to, you know, rise up and overthrow this devil church and all this kind of stuff. But before that happens, one night at the stroke of midnight, humanity is anti-raptured. It's heavily implied, although it's not directly spelled out, because it should be kind of a mystery and a bit at the discretion to the specific game master exactly what you want to say happened. But the general implication is that at some point, one of these devil-worshipping human emperors had made some sort of deal, and when that deal came due, all the unmodified, uncursed, pure humans across the entire world just all up and just vanished right in the middle of whatever they were doing. Humans who had some sort of curse on them, like, you know, people who suffered from lycanthropy, people who practiced magic or had some sort of like active blessing, or had been like directly empowered through contact with a magic item, or people who had any trace of fey blood in their lineage, even if they're not directly the half-elf of being like, you know, mom and dad, one was elf, one was human, even if they're like 10 generations removed from having an elf ancestor, just that little tiny bit of elfishness is enough to spare them from this event. But we're still talking like 50 to 70% of the population disappearing instantly. Also, you know, humans being like the bulk of like, you know, the agricultural labor force and just the general maintenance of all the cities and such, like that, in a real quick fashion, like, you know, civilization just kind of collapses. The halflings and half-elves and the other peoples who are around are not enough. The magic users and other people who have had some sort of like, you know, magic imprint on them start to mutate and change and warp and go crazy. And other, you know, supernatural entities that have been hiding amongst humankind this whole time, in particular vampires, but also kind of other kinds of undead and whatnot, kind of start coming out of the woodwork. Vampires in particular, because their food sources just suddenly vanished on them. The mutant magic users aren't really quite palatable to them. And they've never, in this setting, the vampires can't feed on people with fey blood. They also, orcs, elves, half-elves, they just can't deal with the taste of it. It provides them no nutrition. Optionally, if you want to like have it like a vampire feeds on a she or something like that, it could even like cause them damage, but I didn't actually specifically write anything up about that because I don't have vampire player characters in this version of Orc+Bone, so it doesn't seem directly relevant. But anyway, they all kind of start coming out of the woodwork, and the vampires basically are just stuck with the halfling population that was living alongside as a smaller demographic within human towns and cities. As something that they could feed on. They generally in the past had kind of ignored halflings because of their size. They weren't really a satisfying meal, but now they're the only game in town, and so they start enslaving and actively breeding the halflings to be used as a food source. And soon after all this happens, word starts to filter up into the hinterlands of the north to the orcs. That something's gone wrong, the human empire has fallen, now's the time we can finally strike and raid and all this kind of stuff. And so this big massive gathering of all the orc tribes from all across the north happens, and they march down south through the gap in the mountains that separates the heartlands from the hinterlands to the north. And they end up not like roaring into the land on horseback, or in their case wargback, to raid and pillage, because the countryside was still kind of on fire, like whole cities, like, people just disappearing out of nowhere, like all sorts of fires and things were left untended. So like whole cities just kind of just burned down to empty. The countryside's quiet. They're kind of confused as they get further and further south. And finally, as they get to the outer edges of the cities that are still standing because vampires and other supernatural evils like liches and the mutant wizards that have kind of kept their shit together a bit better mentally, still managed to maintain some sort of control. The orcs arrive, and to their surprise, a group of half-elves and halflings comes out to them and asks them for help freeing them. And so these orcs who've spent years being rejected and being disregarded as just like, amongst the various monstrous trash races of the hinterlands, are suddenly put in this odd situation where like people are expecting them to do something, and they're given a clear foe, and they're given someone to fight on behalf of, which stirs something like deep in them that they haven't felt in a while. And so the orcs of Orc+Bone, it's like another 100 years after that point. Most of the imperial world has kind of just entirely gone to seed, and the orcs have kind of been organized into like crusader armies where they've just been moving from like city to city, region to region, just wiping out vampires and freeing half elves and all that kind of stuff, and halflings as they go. And here and there in their wake, the beginnings of odd little new civilizations are starting to pop up here and there. But if you ever seen any of those shows on the History Channel about like what the world would be like if humanity just up and vanished, and how within a couple hundred years New York City's mostly crumbled apart and turned into forest, that's kind of happening in this world. So there's a lot of open space to explore, to put mysteries, to have old ruins and treasures and lost magic items, and a reason why they're all just kind of sitting out there. The thing that's always kind of bothered me in some ways about the conceit of D&D is just the sheer amount of money that's being left around in dungeons and basements. Like don't they have an economy to run? All that kind of stuff. Just out of sheer habit. Money's probably heavily inflated in the setting, but I don't see why races who've been using coins to trade for thousands of years are just up and stop. They just might want more because it's not worth as much. But there's still a reason to have treasure. This book is very much heavily modeled on this book, the original Greyhawk world setting, written by Gary Gygax. And just in terms of how like the setting's presented, you get like a brief little overview of all the various kingdoms that have risen up. And the real meat and potatoes of this actually is the really thick section on the various kind of environments that have taken over the landscape of the Heartland, and what kind of encounters you can have in there. They tree off, into like, is this a positive encounter? Is this a negative encounter? Are you finding a location? All that kind of stuff. And then what kind of things are in there, or what kind of variables you have. And through going through all that, you actually get a good chunk of what the setting actually really feels like, because you're kind of getting to know what kind of things are potentially living there for your players to find and discover. But it kind of like allows potentially for a bit of like a self-generating terrain kind of effect every time the characters move into a new, hex of landscape. Say like 1 hex equals like 30 miles across, like a day's worth of travel. Every time they enter a new one of those, if you're doing kind of a hex crawl approach, you can like randomly roll to see if they find like some sort of lost ruins, or maybe a small settlement, or come across a herd of giant buffalo and all that kind of stuff. If there's any drawback to having nailed this to the white box rules, is that the white box rules have a pretty limited and basic amount of monsters in their monster section of the book. And so at times I did feel like maybe being a little bit repetitive with the amount of times you can run into manticores. But just as with any of these things, feel free to use it as like a starting point and then pull stats from other D&D supplements. Like any good OSR product, it's super compatible with most things. You don't even have to use the white box rules. You can use AD&D or D&D 5th edition. In some ways I feel that AD&D works better, because if you bring in sages and specialists, that kind of allows you to replicate some of what I was doing with my character classes, where you also have antiquarians and blacksmiths amongst the other adventurers. There's no clerics in this setting. Like the moment that the humans all disappeared, also like the gods went silent. Magic users are around, but it's highly discouraged for players to play one. Like really only half-elves still practice the art, at least of the races described in this side of the setting. And because whether or not of whatever the truth was about what happened that caused the sudden disappearance of humankind, because so many wizards remained behind but were like mutated all weirdly, not like in an X-Men kind of way, but more like a Hills Have Eyes kind of way. They've ended up like reaping a lot of the blame for why that happened. Magic is being blamed. So shamans and witches I present in here, that they kind of get a cultural pass because of the way they are employing magic, but like actual magic users aren't really encouraged. And like I said, there's like no clerics at all. Shaman characters though, as they explore, like what kind of spirits are out there that they can interact with, there are these kind of like newly emerging primordial unformed god entities that are still taking shape, and that their interactions with them can actually kind of lead to what kind of god they end up becoming, kind of a thing, which I feel is interesting. There's a lot of stuff like that in here that's supposed to be give you space for your own kind of in-game world building. It's a setting where like the characters very much can be the founders of civilizations. It's supposed to play into the fact that like in these games you get to a certain level and suddenly you're able to build strongholds and start your own thieves guilds and all these other sorts of things. And so I wanted to intentionally build a game world that actually has open room in between the various established kingdoms, so that players actually could create something of their own without having to come up with some contrivance of being granted land or have to take some land from someone else in order to be able to do it. I reframe a lot of the monsters as spirits and kind of give them a few kind of extra abilities in terms of like their ability to possess things across the barrier between the worlds. In some ways, like the spirit world in this is just basically the Feywild and the Shadowfell just jammed together into one spirit dimension kind of a thing. And beyond that, I'm not much sure else to say. It's moody. It's an alternate take on things. It's, I think, a better example of how to do a monster setting. It's an example of how to take a monster race like orcs and frame them as protagonists without having to negate or rewrite all of their backstory and lore, and to turn them into something that was like some sort of Pollyanna this whole time. There is an angle where they have been a bit misunderstood, but also, like a good chunk of their reputation, was earned deservedly by thousands of years of just being dicks out there in the wilderness. So anyway, on that note, I guess that's some overview of Orc+Bone and just some of my ideas of like how this is kind of supposed to be used. You know, pick a spot you like and start off there. There's actually, I feel like there's a lot of different campaign opportunities to be had. You know, are you defending one of the last little halfling civilizations that have started to arise? Are you with one of the crusading armies trying to free halflings? Are you just out exploring the wilderness? There's all the stuff with the you know, emerging kingdom of Duradia and Prince Vovo's plans to start setting up colonies and building a navy to, you know, because, you know, from his understanding of history, of human history, you know, like that was like one of the key things that allowed the human empire to like establish dominance over such a wide area of land, was their control of naval power and the two little inland seas that kind of flanked the central area. Politics, self-generated politics, just classic Frank Frazetta fire and ice type adventuring. There's a lot of different ways, you know, Orc+Bone can be used, and I would like you to try to explore it and let me know what you found. Anyway, so like I said, leave comments, hit buttons, go to websites and look at things and consider purchasing them, and all that other good stuff. Stay waspinated.